In 1943, over the Pacific Islands, Japanese pilots, seasoned by years of success, scoffed at the new American fighter, the F6F Hellcat. They mocked its bulky design and seemingly clumsy build. The intelligence reports that reached them only reinforced their belief that the new American aircraft was destined to fail. To them, it appeared another overhyped attempt that would soon be discarded like many before it. Their A6M-0, a plane that had dominated the skies for years, had become synonymous with superiority. It was fast, maneuverable, and deadly. The Zero had proven its mettle against countless adversaries, from British Hurricanes to American P-40s, even Dutch Brewster Buffaloes. Every enemy plane that crossed its path had fallen, leaving Japanese pilots with an unshakable sense of invincibility. The Japanese leadership and their airmen were sure that the Hellcat would meet the same fate as previous American attempts. They believed the Zero's unmatched speed and agility, combined with the expertise of their pilots, would always ensure victory. The Zero, with its light frame, extraordinary maneuverability, and lethal weaponry, was the perfect embodiment of their air combat philosophy. Its design had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare, and the Japanese pilots were convinced that no other plane, especially one as bulky and seemingly underwhelming as the Hellcat, could challenge their dominance. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that over the coming months, their belief in the Zero's reign would be shattered. The Hellcat, which they dismissed as an impractical aircraft, was about to become the greatest threat their forces had ever faced. The American engineers had created a machine that looked wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to violate all the principles that the Japanese had perfected. Yet, in the hands of skilled pilots, it would prove to be a game-changer. At first glance, the Hellcat seemed an unlikely contender. Its size and weight, seemingly disproportionate to its purpose, made it a subject of ridicule. It weighed nearly twice as much as the Zero, and its design appeared to prioritize durability over agility. In fact, its sheer weight was often cited as a flaw that, in the Japanese view, would make it easy prey for their nimble, quick-moving aircraft. The Zero, they believed, would be able to dance around the Hellcat in any dogfight, exploiting its superior turning radius and rapid response time. What the Japanese failed to recognize, however, was that the Hellcat wasn't built to outmaneuver the Zero. It was designed to survive the fight long enough to win it. What no one anticipated was the Hellcat's ability to absorb damage, its power to endure the punishment of the air war. The Hellcat was heavily armored, an attribute that allowed it to survive longer in battle, even when caught in the crossfire of Japanese fire. Unlike the Zero, it carried armor to protect its pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks to minimize the risk of fires, and enough firepower to eliminate the most dangerous adversaries in the sky. The Zero, in contrast, was built for speed and maneuverability, but with little regard for protection. It was a delicate machine, capable of devastating attacks, but easily crippled by even moderate damage. The belief that the Hellcat would be no more than a temporary inconvenience for the Japanese would soon be disproven. For the Japanese, the first encounter with the Hellcat in the skies over the Pacific would mark the beginning of the end for their air dominance. In combat, the Hellcat proved not only capable of surviving, but also thriving. It was a fighter that could take a hit and keep flying, a plane that could outlast its adversaries and ultimately outfight them. As the battles raged on, Japanese pilots, once confident in their superiority, would soon realize that the Hellcat wasn't just a new fighter. It was a revolution in naval combat that they weren't prepared for. The first few engagements with Hellcats saw the Japanese dismissing them as mere novelties, easily outclassed by the superior skill of their own pilots. But as the Hellcats began to rack up kills, and as the Japanese saw their own numbers dwindle in the sky, they began to understand that this wasn't just another American failure. The Hellcat was a plane that could not be ignored. It was not merely a fighter. It was the key to changing the course of aerial combat in the Pacific. By the time the Japanese came to this realization, the Hellcat's impact on the war was already profound. The aircraft's effectiveness in the hands of skilled pilots began to rewrite the rules of aerial supremacy, leaving Japanese airmen to grapple with the stark reality that their previously uncontested reign in the skies was coming to an end. In the following months, the Hellcat would go on to become one of the most feared aircraft of the Pacific War, proving that it was not only a match for the Zero, but that it was better in nearly every measurable way. This shift in air superiority would come to define the final years of the war in the Pacific and change the future of carrier-based combat forever. In retrospect, the initial derision of the Hellcat by the Japanese pilots, the very pilots who had once dominated the skies, now seemed like a tragic misjudgment, one that cost them not just the fight, but the war. The Hellcat, despite its humble beginnings in the eyes of the enemy, would ultimately be the harbinger of their defeat. On September 30th, 1943, over Marcus Island, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui, a seasoned Japanese pilot, found himself facing an American fighter that he hadn't anticipated. He had been part of many successful missions against American bombers and fighters, but this encounter was different. Initially, he mistook the F6F Hellcat for a torpedo bomber, something that was hardly a challenge for his skills. His expectations were based on previous encounters with American planes that, despite their resilience, were far from formidable threats in the world of aerial combat. But the Hellcat proved to be anything but the easy target he had assumed. As Fukui climbed to intercept, he realized too late that this was no ordinary aircraft. The Hellcat's speed and maneuverability were far superior to anything he had encountered before. As he closed in, hoping to take advantage of the Hellcat's presumed clumsiness, he was struck by an unexpected turn of events. The Hellcat didn't attempt to evade him in the predictable manner. Instead, it stayed calm, seemingly unaffected by his approach. When Fukui made his move, hoping to turn tightly and gain the advantageous position behind the Hellcat, he found himself being outmaneuvered in a way that defied all his expectations. What followed next was something entirely unforeseen. The Hellcat, instead of running from the engagement or relying solely on its speed, displayed a capability to outlast his assault. It went vertical. The Japanese pilot, stunned by the aircraft's sheer performance, tried to follow, but the Hellcat's climb left him struggling to maintain control. As Fukui's airspeed dropped and his plane's ability to continue the chase waned, the American fighter was already in position to counterattack. In the span of mere moments, Fukui's aircraft was riddled with bullets. The Hellcat's 6 machine guns poured fire into his plane, and though Fukui managed to escape by diving into a spiraling descent, his plane had suffered severe damage. His wingman and the reconnaissance plane they had been escorting didn't make it back. Fukui's after-action report made a note of the encounter, but the real implications of that first fight would take time to register. The Hellcat had performed beyond expectations, and this first kill marked a stark shift in the air war over the Pacific. The Japanese were used to quick and decisive victories in the skies, but the Hellcat had changed the calculus. It wasn't just the aircraft's superior speed or firepower that made the difference, but its sheer durability and ability to absorb damage and still remain a formidable force. For the Americans, this success was a milestone in their ongoing efforts to take the fight to the Japanese. Until this point, they had been on the defensive in many aspects of the war. They had been outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and often underestimated by the Japanese pilots. But now, with the Hellcat, they had a weapon that could meet the Japanese in the air on equal footing, if not more. The Hellcat was not just an improvement over the previous models. It was a revolution in naval aviation. For the Japanese pilots, though, this was a bitter pill to swallow. They had long believed that their aircraft were superior, that their training and skill gave them the edge. The Zero had been undefeated, and it had become a symbol of Japan's military prowess. The assumption that any new American aircraft would be just another failure was deeply ingrained in their minds. But the Hellcat proved them wrong. It was a devastating reminder that technological superiority wasn't the only factor in the equation. The American pilots, with their better training, improved tactics, and now the Hellcat, were no longer the underdogs they once were. They were a force to be reckoned with, one that could no longer be dismissed. The success of the Hellcat was not just about the kills it racked up in the early months. It was about breaking the psychological barrier that had once allowed Japanese pilots to dismiss their American counterparts as inferior. The Japanese had laughed at the idea of a heavy, bulky fighter like the Hellcat taking down their nimble Zeros. But the reality was quickly proving otherwise. As the battles wore on, the Hellcat's kill ratio began to soar. It was clear that the Hellcat had become more than just another plane. It had become a symbol of American resolve and technological superiority. The result was more than just a tactical victory. For the American pilots, the Hellcat represented the culmination of years of hard work, a series of incremental improvements that allowed them to finally hold their own against the Japanese. But more importantly, it gave them the confidence to challenge the enemy with a renewed sense of purpose. They had seen firsthand how the Hellcat could stand up to the legendary Zero and come out on top. The days of being outgunned and outflown were over. For the Japanese, the Hellcat's success would be a wake-up call, one that they would try to ignore but ultimately could not. The very pilots who had scoffed at its design were now confronted with the reality of its power in combat. The early losses, like the one Fukui had barely survived, would be the first of many. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, and the Hellcat was leading the way. In the months that followed, as more Hellcats entered service and more battles were fought, the Japanese pilots began to realize that they had underestimated their American adversaries. What they had once viewed as a blunder, an aircraft too heavy and unwieldy to pose a real threat, had proven to be the very thing that would change the course of the war. The Hellcat wasn't just a success. It was the beginning of the end for Japan's aerial supremacy in the Pacific. The victories of the Hellcat were not just about aerial kills, but about breaking down the mental barriers that had defined the conflict up until that point. As the Japanese forces started to feel the weight of the Hellcat's presence in the skies, they began to understand the true cost of underestimating their enemies. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of the shifting tides of war, and it was only the beginning of what would become an unstoppable American effort to reclaim dominance in the Pacific. In 1943, as the new F6F Hellcats entered the skies of the Pacific, the initial successes they garnered did not come without a series of serious obstacles. Despite the aircraft's superior firepower, durability, and overall performance, many American pilots struggled with the transition to the new machine. The Hellcat, being significantly heavier than the nimble Japanese Zero, presented challenges in terms of maneuverability and pilot adaptation. The Zero had dominated the Pacific skies for years, and its agility had become legendary. American pilots, many of whom had trained on lighter, faster planes, found themselves grappling with the reality that the Hellcat's weight and bulk weren't an asset in every combat scenario. At first, the new tactics required to excel in the Hellcat, focusing on altitude, energy, and speed, didn't come easily. American pilots had to relearn how to fight, adapting to the idea that simply turning with the enemy wasn't always the best strategy. The Zero had built its reputation on its extraordinary turning ability, and in many encounters, American pilots instinctively tried to match that maneuverability. But the Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. Instead, its strength lay in its ability to maintain superior speed and altitude, using its weight to its advantage, forcing the enemy into situations where the Hellcat could strike with overwhelming force. These early battles, though successful in terms of kills, were often messy and difficult for the American pilots. Many had difficulty adjusting to the Hellcat's flight characteristics, especially its more rigid controls and slower response time compared to the agile Zeros. This created a gap in the American forces, where veteran pilots who had fought in earlier battles, such as the F4F Wildcat, were more comfortable with the new tactics, while newer pilots, unfamiliar with the complexities of the Hellcat, struggled to adapt. Furthermore, the internal resistance to the Hellcat's design and combat methods was not just limited to the pilots in the field. The leadership within the Navy was not always on board with the new aircraft. Some senior officers were skeptical of the Hellcat's ability to perform on the same level as the Zero. Their criticism stemmed from a deeper issue, a belief in the superiority of traditional dogfighting and the reliance on nimbleness, which had served American pilots well in previous engagements. The new tactics, which emphasized maintaining an advantageous position and using the Hellcat's speed and durability, conflicted with their established understanding of air combat. This resistance wasn't solely a matter of tactical preference. It was also about the integration of new technology and the cultural shift it required. The Hellcat was a product of a rapidly advancing technological revolution, one that was transforming warfare on every level. The pilots, particularly those who had grown up in the pre-war military culture, found it difficult to embrace these changes. There was a sense of distrust towards the machine itself, as many pilots doubted that it could surpass the Zero, which had proven so effective in dogfights. Some even mocked the Hellcat's bulky, heavy design, failing to see that its weight was, in fact, one of its greatest advantages in the larger context of combat, offering more durability and firepower. The true potential of the Hellcat wasn't realized in the first few months of combat. While it was capable of withstanding tremendous damage, surviving attacks that would have crippled other aircraft, its full effectiveness wasn't evident until American pilots began to fully integrate the new tactics into their combat repertoire. The psychological barrier of overcoming the Zero's reputation, combined with the technical challenges of adapting to a new fighter, meant that the early Hellcat missions were far from the flawless victories that would come later. Moreover, the coordination between pilots and the use of the Hellcat's advanced radar-guided tactics presented yet another hurdle. While Japanese pilots still relied heavily on visual spotting and traditional methods of combat, American pilots began using radar-guided fighter direction, an innovation that provided them with a critical advantage. However, this technological leap required time and expertise to fully implement. Early in the war, many American pilots didn't have the experience or the equipment to make the most of radar assistance, making their job even harder. Yet, despite these challenges, the Hellcat's early engagements began to demonstrate its potential. American pilots slowly began to adapt to the aircraft's unique strengths. As they got more accustomed to using the Hellcat's capabilities to their advantage, particularly its powerful engine and ability to stay in the fight despite taking significant damage, their kill ratios improved. The battle tactics, which had initially been a struggle, began to make sense, and the American pilots started turning the tide. The challenges faced by the Hellcat pilots were not solely about the aircraft itself, but also about overcoming the mentality that had been ingrained in air combat for years. The Zero's dominance had created a narrative where Japanese pilots were revered for their skills, and American pilots were considered secondary. But with the Hellcat, that narrative was challenged. It forced both the American and Japanese forces to reconsider their assumptions about air superiority, and by doing so, it started to shape the future of the Pacific War. The difficulties faced by the Hellcat pilots also highlighted the underlying tensions within the American military itself. As the new tactics and technologies began to prove effective, those who had initially resisted the changes found it hard to admit that the younger, more modern approaches were the key to overcoming the Japanese. Some of the older pilots, who had fought in earlier battles, felt threatened by the new generation of aviators who had embraced the Hellcat's design and the strategies that came with it. The battles were as much about internal military politics as they were about engaging the enemy. Ultimately, however, the Hellcat began to prove its worth in the sky. The early struggles and resistance faded as more pilots became proficient in its use. The heavier, less maneuverable aircraft had proven its superiority in other ways. Its durability, its superior firepower, and its ability to sustain attacks and continue fighting. While the Zero remained a formidable opponent, the Hellcat slowly began to dominate the skies of the Pacific, fulfilling the promise of its design. The early struggles with the Hellcat were an important part of its story. They marked the transition from skepticism to acceptance, from technological failure to triumph. These challenges, combined with the pilot's growing confidence and adaptation, set the stage for the Hellcat's eventual role in turning the tide of the war in the Pacific. And although it had faced many early setbacks, it would ultimately go on to prove that the weight of the machine, far from being a liability, was a defining feature that would help change the course of aerial combat in World War II. On October 5, 1943, over Wake Island, the pilots of the F6F Hellcats finally came to realize the full extent of their newfound power. The Hellcat, once seen as an unwieldy, heavy fighter, had begun to prove its worth in combat, and on this day, it demonstrated its true potential. The American pilots had now fully embraced the unique capabilities of their aircraft, realizing that their strength lay not in trying to outmaneuver the agile Japanese Zeros, but in utilizing their own advantages: superior speed, firepower, and durability. In previous engagements, the American pilots had struggled with adapting to the heavier, less nimble Hellcat. But over time, they had learned that they didn't need to match the Zero in terms of agility. Instead, they could use the Hellcat's raw power and speed to dictate the terms of combat. The new approach was straightforward yet revolutionary. Instead of engaging in dogfights where nimbleness was the primary advantage, Hellcat pilots would use energy fighting tactics, maintaining speed and altitude, and striking with overwhelming force when the time was right. On October 5th, during the battle over Wake Island, the American pilots executed this strategy with precision. As the Japanese Zeros came diving down from above, expecting to engage in a classic aerial duel, the Hellcats did not attempt to turn with them. Instead, they climbed rapidly, using their superior power to outpace the Zeros, forcing the Japanese pilots into unfavorable positions. The Hellcats would dive, take shots, and then climb back up before the Zeros had a chance to react. It was a methodical, ruthless approach that left the Japanese no room to maneuver. With every encounter, the American pilots became more confident in their abilities. As they shot down enemy aircraft, their belief in the Hellcat grew stronger. The aircraft's heavy build, once thought to be a hindrance, now proved to be a great asset. The Hellcat could withstand more damage than the lighter Zeros, and its 650 caliber machine guns unleashed a devastating amount of firepower that could tear through the Japanese aircraft with ease. The American pilots, emboldened by their success, found themselves adapting their tactics more fluidly, knowing they had the upper hand in any engagement. As the battle continued over Wake Island, the Hellcats proved their superiority. The Japanese, accustomed to their dominance in the skies, were taken aback by the resilience and tactical prowess of the American pilots. The Zeros, despite their agility and maneuverability, could not match the Hellcat's strength in a straight-up fight. The American pilots used their advantage in speed to stay on the offensive, dictating the flow of the battle rather than reacting to the enemy's movements. The success over Wake Island marked a critical turning point in the Pacific Air War. Commanders back in the United States, who had been cautious in their initial assessment of the Hellcat, were now convinced of its effectiveness. The American pilots had proven that the Hellcat was not only capable of standing up to the Zeros, but also of systematically overpowering them in aerial combat. With the Hellcat's increasing success, new tactics were adopted, and the aircraft's role in the war expanded. The Hellcat was no longer just another tool in the American arsenal. It had become the decisive factor in air superiority over the Pacific. In the months that followed, these new tactics were refined and further implemented, solidifying the Hellcat's place as the primary carrier-based fighter in the U.S. Navy. The pilots, now fully comfortable with their aircraft, began to take the fight to the Japanese with unprecedented ferocity. They began systematically eliminating enemy aircraft at a rate that had once been unimaginable. What was once thought to be a cumbersome fighter had transformed into a deadly weapon, and the American pilots had become experts in its use. The success over Wake Island did more than just secure a victory in a single engagement. It marked the beginning of a shift in the balance of power in the skies. The tactics honed by the Hellcat pilots would be used in subsequent battles, each victory further demonstrating the aircraft's superiority. With every successful mission, the Hellcat's kill-to-loss ratio continued to improve, eventually reaching an astounding 19.1. This remarkable achievement would not have been possible without the critical realization that the Hellcat's true advantage lay not in matching the Zeros in their domain of maneuverability, but in capitalizing on its own strengths: power, durability, and firepower. The October 5 battle over Wake Island became the foundation for the strategic and tactical innovations that would define American air superiority in the Pacific. The shift from relying on traditional dogfighting tactics to embracing the Hellcat's unique abilities marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese dominance in the skies. It was a victory not just for the Hellcat, but for the men who had dared to rethink their approach to aerial combat. In doing so, they had transformed the course of the war in the Pacific and demonstrated that innovation and adaptability were the keys to victory. As the war raged on, the lessons learned from Wake Island would be applied time and again. The Hellcat's success was not simply due to its technological superiority, but also because the American pilots had been able to adapt to its design and develop new strategies that exploited its strengths. They had gone from skepticism to full confidence, transforming the Hellcat from an underdog to the most lethal fighter in the Pacific. The victory over Wake Island was a symbol of the growing prowess of American naval aviation and the beginning of the end for Japanese aerial dominance in the Pacific theater. On June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. It was a culmination of years of combat, during which the Japanese pilots, once considered the pinnacle of aerial combat, were decisively defeated by American forces. The Hellcat, which had once been dismissed as an inferior fighter by Japanese pilots, had become the decisive weapon in the U.S. Navy's arsenal. The battle began with American forces, now fully in control of their air superiority, launching a series of well-coordinated attacks on Japanese carriers and airfields. The Hellcats, bolstered by their newfound tactics and confidence, tore through the skies with a precision and power that left the Japanese scrambling. The Hellcat's ability to absorb damage and keep fighting, along with their overwhelming firepower, made them nearly invincible in combat. The Japanese pilots, by contrast, were facing not only a superior aircraft, but also an adversary who had learned how to use their new weapon to its full advantage. For the Japanese, this was the turning point. They had long been used to dominating the skies, their Zeros revered for their agility and speed. But now, in the face of the Hellcat's superior firepower, endurance, and speed, the tables had turned. The Japanese were losing aircraft at an alarming rate. The Hellcats, with their superior range, firepower, and sturdiness, could sustain damage and continue fighting, while the Zeros, more fragile and less resilient, could not withstand the barrage. The Japanese pilots, who had once laughed at the Hellcat and dismissed it as a heavy, ineffective fighter, now found themselves facing a force they could neither outmaneuver nor outgun. The skill and courage of the Hellcat pilots had made them an unstoppable force. What had once seemed like a sure victory for Japan had now turned into a disaster. The Japanese lost more than 400 aircraft during the battle, with the majority of them falling to the Hellcats. On the other side, the Americans lost fewer than 30 aircraft, a testament to the superiority of the Hellcat and the effectiveness of the new tactics being employed. The impact on Japanese morale was devastating. As experienced pilots were shot down in large numbers, the loss of skilled personnel severely weakened Japan's ability to defend its airspace. The Japanese fleet, which had once been a formidable force, was now in disarray. They no longer had the advantage in the air, and with their pilots being decimated, they were unable to mount an effective counteroffensive. Meanwhile, the American forces, confident in their superiority, continued to strike with precision, targeting key Japanese bases and naval assets. The battle had become less about individual dogfights and more about overwhelming force and strategic precision. The American pilots, who had once been cautious and unsure in their new aircraft, had now embraced the Hellcat fully. They used it not only as a fighter but as a weapon of destruction, wiping out Japan's remaining air power in one fell swoop. By the end of the battle, the Hellcat had decisively proven its worth. What had been seen as a heavy, unwieldy aircraft was now recognized as the most lethal weapon in the Pacific skies. The Japanese, who had once dismissed the Hellcat with scorn, were now forced to acknowledge its superiority. Their earlier mockery had turned into desperation, and the tables had completely turned. The success of the Hellcat pilots at the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a victory in terms of military tactics. It was a complete transformation in the way the world viewed aerial warfare in the Pacific. The Hellcat, under the control of American pilots, had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and rewritten the rules of naval combat. The battle confirmed that the technological advances and strategic innovations of the American forces had given them the upper hand, and Japan's once unassailable air power had been decimated. For the American pilots, this victory was not just about winning the battle. It was about proving themselves to a world that had doubted their ability to master the skies. They had faced the best pilots in the world and emerged victorious, and in doing so, they had gained the respect they deserved. The Hellcat's success was no longer just a question of hardware. It was a question of skill, training, and the ability to adapt to new methods of warfare. The Hellcat pilots had taken an aircraft that had once been underestimated and turned it into the most effective weapon in the Pacific. By the time the Battle of the Philippine Sea was over, the respect for the Hellcat and its pilots was undeniable. What had once been seen as a mismatch of technology had turned into a demonstration of the power of innovation, determination, and adaptability. The Hellcat had proven that in modern warfare, it wasn't just about agility or firepower. It was about the ability to use the advantages at your disposal to create a system that could overwhelm the enemy. The battle marked the beginning of the end for Japanese air supremacy in the Pacific. With their fleet in ruins and their pilots decimated, the Japanese could no longer contest the skies with the same effectiveness they once had. Meanwhile, the Americans, buoyed by their success with the Hellcat, would go on to dominate the Pacific theater in the months and years to come. The Japanese had underestimated their enemy, and in doing so, they had sealed their fate. As the Hellcat pilots continued to build on their success, they found themselves not only securing victory after victory, but also earning the respect of their peers and enemies alike. The American pilots had proven themselves to be the masters of the Pacific skies, and the Hellcat had become a symbol of American resilience and innovation. As the F6F Hellcat proved its superiority in the skies, a significant shift in perception began to unfold not just on the front lines, but also within American society. With every victory over the Japanese, a new layer of respect was earned by the pilots flying the Hellcat, and particularly by the African-American pilots who had become an integral part of these successes. The battlefield was no longer only a place where the war against Japan was being fought. It became a stage where a deeper social revolution was taking place, one that was quietly reshaping the very fabric of American racial dynamics. For years, African-American soldiers had faced systemic racism and discrimination, with limited opportunities in the military, especially in combat roles. The prevailing ideology of racial superiority had long dictated that black soldiers were unfit for positions of leadership, and even in combat, they were often relegated to menial tasks or barred from flying at all. However, the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, who had trained under extremely difficult conditions, were defying these barriers. The success of the Hellcat, paired with the bravery of these pilots, marked the beginning of a shift. They were no longer seen as merely participants in the war. They were becoming a symbol of defiance against the long-standing racial prejudices that had governed American society. The pilots of the 332nd, many of whom had faced prejudice both within the military and from society at large, were now fighting not just to defeat Japan, but also to break the chains of racial injustice at home. They were proving that their courage, skill, and commitment to their country were as strong as, if not stronger than, any of their white counterparts. Their success in combat was more than a military achievement. It was a statement that shattered the racial assumptions that had long excluded African Americans from full participation in American society. As they climbed into their Hellcats, they were not only flying to defend freedom abroad, but also to challenge the very essence of discrimination in their own country. The victories they achieved, especially in the face of an enemy that had long been revered for its air combat prowess, began to have a profound effect on the African American community. They inspired millions of Black Americans who had been systematically denied the same opportunities and recognition as their white counterparts. The Tuskegee Airmen, though still underappreciated by mainstream media and the public, were gaining a reputation for excellence. They were proving that despite the racial barriers that had been placed in their path, they could excel, outshine their peers, and break down the racial walls that had kept them segregated. The transformation on the battlefield, where these men fought with a sense of purpose far beyond patriotism, became a reflection of the larger struggle for civil rights back home. Their efforts and successes were quietly but powerfully challenging the deeply ingrained racist ideologies that had long governed American thought and culture. As the Tuskegee Airmen racked up victories in the sky, the air became charged with a new kind of energy, a sense that racial prejudices could be eradicated through tangible proof, that Black pilots could be just as skilled, brave, and effective as any white pilot. Their actions served as a powerful antidote to the entrenched narratives that sought to perpetuate racial inferiority. As the Hellcats soared through the sky, they carried not just the hopes of their fellow soldiers, but also the aspirations of an entire race seeking equality and justice. Their success in the air was a direct challenge to the stereotype that African Americans were inherently inferior in terms of intelligence, ability, and courage. They proved that excellence had nothing to do with the color of one's skin, but with the quality of one's character and determination. The influence of the Tuskegee Airmen and their success with the F6F Hellcat reached beyond the military. Their heroism began to resonate deeply in the African American community, symbolizing the possibility of a future where racial equality could be achieved. Black newspapers, which had long advocated for the rights of African Americans, began to highlight the exploits of these pilots, giving them the recognition they had long been denied by the mainstream press. This growing awareness among the African American community was paralleled by an increasing demand for change in the nation's laws and policies regarding race. The Tuskegee Airmen were proving that Blacks could excel in roles that had been historically reserved for whites, and that they had the right to be seen as equals in every facet of society. Yet, despite their undeniable contributions, the battle was far from over. While these men were becoming heroes within their communities, the wider society still struggled to overcome its deeply rooted prejudices. Even as the American military gradually began to recognize the value of these pilots, the larger social structure continued to marginalize them. The success of the Hellcat pilots could not erase the reality that racial discrimination was still rampant in American society. However, the undeniable proof of their ability to perform at the highest level on the battlefield laid the groundwork for the eventual dismantling of segregation and the challenge to systemic racism in the years that followed. By fighting with distinction, the Tuskegee Airmen helped pave the way for future generations of African Americans to pursue careers and opportunities that had once been denied to them. Their bravery and skill were not only victories in the air, but also victories in the ongoing struggle for civil rights. The Hellcat, a symbol of American industrial might and military innovation, became intertwined with the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, an enduring reminder that the battle for equality was just as crucial as the fight for victory over tyranny abroad. Their success was not merely a military achievement, but a key turning point in the larger movement toward racial equality in America. The courage displayed by these men, who fought against the odds both in the sky and in society, became a powerful force in the fight for racial justice. Their story would continue to inspire future generations, proving that the path to equality could be carved through perseverance, skill, and the undeniable truth that excellence is colorblind. Their legacy, intertwined with the history of the Hellcat, would echo through the decades as a testament to the ability of individuals to challenge and ultimately dismantle the prejudices of their time. After the end of the war in 1945, the American pilots, particularly the African American pilots who had fought with distinction, found themselves facing significant challenges in receiving the recognition they so richly deserved. Their bravery, skill, and sacrifice in the skies had been pivotal in securing victory in the Pacific. Yet the acknowledgement of their achievements was delayed and often withheld altogether. The military and society at large had a long history of racial discrimination, and for these pilots, the path to recognition would prove to be as arduous as the battles they fought during the war. Despite their undeniable contributions, the Tuskegee Airmen and other black aviators were met with indifference or outright disregard from the mainstream military and public. While their white counterparts received accolades and were celebrated for their heroism, the black pilots struggled to gain the same recognition. Their efforts were often minimized, and their heroic actions were either underreported or ignored in many circles. The military's reluctance to fully acknowledge their accomplishments reflected the broader societal reluctance to accept African Americans as equals, especially in roles that were traditionally reserved for white Americans. One of the most glaring examples of this injustice was the delayed issuance of medals and honors. Many of the Tuskegee Airmen, after completing their tours of duty, had to wait years before being awarded the same level of recognition as their peers. Some pilots received medals only after persistent advocacy by fellow airmen or public pressure from civil rights groups and black newspapers, which had long championed the pilots' contributions. But even when awards were granted, they were often seen as a belated form of recognition, offered only after these men had been ignored or dismissed for so long. While the military bureaucracy slowly began to recognize the significance of their service, the reality was that the society they returned to was still deeply divided by racial prejudices. Many of the African American veterans who had fought for the freedom of others returned home to face segregation, discrimination, and a lack of opportunities. The very men who had been among the most skilled and courageous pilots in the war were forced to navigate the same barriers to equality that they had fought against at home. They found themselves in a society that celebrated their victories abroad, but failed to acknowledge their right to the same respect and opportunities as white veterans. The difficulty in receiving awards was symbolic of the broader struggle for recognition and equality that these men would face for years to come. In the years following the war, there was a growing awareness of the racial injustices faced by African American veterans. Civil rights leaders and advocates worked tirelessly to ensure that the contributions of black soldiers, including the Tuskegee Airmen, were given the recognition they deserved. However, this struggle was not easy, and many of the veterans who had earned the right to be celebrated found themselves waiting for the public and the military to acknowledge their worth. Despite these challenges, the determination of the Tuskegee Airmen and other African American pilots never wavered. Their achievements in the air continued to speak for themselves, and over time, their story became one of inspiration, not just for Black Americans, but for people of all races who believed in the power of perseverance and equality. While it took years for these men to receive the official recognition they were owed, their legacy endured. The struggle for acknowledgement became part of their narrative, and their story would eventually become a symbol of the larger battle for civil rights and social justice in America. The long process of gaining recognition was marked by frustration and disappointment. The pilots who had once fought to prove their worth on the battlefield now had to fight for the recognition of their service. In some cases, they were forced to petition for the honors they had earned, and even then, the process was slow and bureaucratic. But through it all, the Tuskegee Airmen remained determined, knowing that their contributions were undeniable. Their achievements, both on the front lines and in the fight for racial equality, would eventually be recognized. But the delay in honoring them served as a stark reminder of the long road ahead for African Americans in the military and beyond. By the time the official recognition began to trickle in, many of the pilots had already moved on with their lives, having faced the harsh realities of a segregated America. The honors, though appreciated, could never fully erase the years of being overlooked and undervalued. However, the eventual recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen's heroism marked a turning point in how African American veterans were perceived by society. The enduring legacy of these pilots, who had fought both against tyranny abroad and against prejudice at home, became a beacon for future generations of African Americans seeking equality and justice. Their story, long ignored or minimized, would eventually be celebrated by a nation that had once failed to honor their service. The medals and accolades they finally received, though late in coming, represented more than just recognition for their wartime efforts. They symbolized a shift in the national consciousness, a step toward the dismantling of the racial barriers that had once kept these men from receiving their due. The Tuskegee Airmen had fought for recognition, and though they had to fight for it long after the war had ended, their legacy would eventually be celebrated as one of the greatest accomplishments in the history of the United States military. Decades after the end of World War II, the contributions of the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-black squadron of fighter pilots, had been long overlooked and underappreciated by the nation they served. For years, their bravery in the skies was met with skepticism and racial prejudice, both from within the military and from society at large. Their incredible achievements, which included extraordinary combat records, had largely been ignored or minimized in the narrative of American military history. However, in 2007, the country began to rectify this wrong, in a moment that had been long awaited by the Tuskegee Airmen and their supporters. In a ceremony at the White House, President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the surviving members of the Tuskegee Airmen, an act of formal recognition and respect for their service. This medal, the highest civilian honor that can be bestowed by Congress, was not just a recognition of their accomplishments during World War II, but also a symbol of the significant social change they had helped bring about in America. The award was a long overdue acknowledgement of their courage, resilience, and skill in combat, which had defied the racist assumptions of the time. The Tuskegee Airmen had fought not only against the enemy in the skies, but also against the deep-rooted racism within their own country and military. In the years following their service, many had struggled to receive the recognition they deserved, but their actions had inspired a movement for civil rights and equality. Their time in combat had already proven their mettle. The Tuskegee Airmen had achieved an impressive combat record, with a kill ratio that matched or exceeded that of their white counterparts, and their efforts had been instrumental in securing American air superiority over the Axis powers. Despite facing harsh racial discrimination, the pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron and the other Tuskegee units had not only proven their ability to fly, but had also shown the world that racial barriers could be overcome in pursuit of a common goal. For years after the war, however, the historical record had minimized their contributions. The military's initial reluctance to fully recognize the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen reflected broader societal biases, and it would take decades for their contributions to be formally acknowledged. Many of the surviving airmen, now aging and with the horrors of war behind them, had to fight for recognition from the government and from the public. It was only through decades of advocacy from both the airmen themselves and civil rights activists that their history was finally brought into the light. In 2007, this fight for recognition culminated in the ceremony at the White House. The presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen was not just a moment of personal honor for the surviving pilots, but a broader acknowledgement that their courage and sacrifice had helped shape the future of racial equality in America. It was a historic moment for a group of men who had fought for justice and equality both in the air and on the ground. The act of recognition also held significant symbolic value for the nation as a whole. It represented a shift in how America viewed its own history, acknowledging the role that African Americans had played in the defense of the nation. The Tuskegee Airmen had faced systemic racism, and they had done so with dignity, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to their duty. The medal they received in 2007 was a symbolic apology for the years of injustice they had endured, and an acknowledgement of their rightful place in American history. For many of the surviving Tuskegee Airmen, the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony in 2007 was a bittersweet experience. By then, many of the men who had served in the squadron had passed away, leaving only a few of the original members to receive the honor. Yet, despite the passing of time, the recognition was a powerful moment that validated their sacrifices and solidified their legacy as American heroes. The ceremony was not just about medals and recognition. It was about affirming the legacy of a generation of African Americans who had been denied recognition and respect for far too long. The awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen was not just about one group of individuals. It represented the triumph of human dignity over prejudice, the power of perseverance in the face of adversity, and the eventual acknowledgement that all who serve their country deserve to be recognized, regardless of race or background. For the Tuskegee Airmen, this recognition was not simply a personal honor, but a monumental shift in how African Americans were perceived in the military and in society at large. In the years following the ceremony, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen gained more recognition in popular culture, with books, documentaries, and even Hollywood films shedding light on their legacy. This surge of interest in their story helped ensure that future generations of Americans would never forget the contributions of these brave pilots, whose skill and bravery in the face of adversity had changed the course of history. The 2007 recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen was the culmination of a long and difficult journey, one that had spanned over half a century. The shift from neglect to admiration was a testament to the perseverance of the pilots themselves, the civil rights leaders who fought for their recognition, and the changing attitudes of American society. It was a moment that reflected not just the valor of these men, but also the gradual progress toward a more inclusive and equal society. A society that would no longer overlook the contributions of African Americans in the fight for freedom and justice. The Congressional Gold Medal ceremony in 2007 was not just a moment of personal achievement for the Tuskegee Airmen, but a broader acknowledgement that their struggles and their victories had helped lay the foundation for future generations of African Americans to continue the fight for equality and opportunity. This recognition, delayed but ultimately delivered, marked the final chapter in the long struggle to ensure that the history of the Tuskegee Airmen and of all African American veterans would be written and remembered. It was a reminder that recognition, though often delayed, was always worth the fight. By 2007, the historical journey of the Tuskegee Airmen had come full circle, marking an extraordinary chapter in the story of America's fight against both fascism and racial prejudice. Their heroism had not only contributed decisively to the defeat of the Axis powers during World War II, but had also become a powerful symbol in the ongoing struggle against racial injustice. Though their achievements had been long overlooked and often buried under the weight of racial bias, these men had fought not only for freedom across the world, but also for the recognition and equality they deserved at home. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen was far greater than their military accomplishments. Theirs was a victory not only against the enemy in the sky, but also against the deep-rooted racial prejudices that had long held African Americans back from full participation in the nation's defense. In the face of systemic exclusion, discrimination, and disbelief from their own country, these pilots proved that race had no bearing on one's ability to serve, sacrifice, and succeed. In the decades following the war, as the nation grappled with its deeply entrenched racial inequality, the Tuskegee Airmen's story remained largely untold. The recognition they deserved was delayed for many years, yet their feats had continued to inspire. Their courage in the air had defied expectations, and their conduct in the face of adversity had shown that the strength of the human spirit could transcend any arbitrary classification of race. Their victories during the Pacific War played a pivotal role in ensuring Allied dominance, yet their contributions went largely unnoticed by the broader public, overshadowed by the prevailing racial attitudes of the time. By the time their recognition came, decades had passed since they first flew into combat. But in 2007, the American public was finally forced to confront the injustice of their long-ignored achievements. When President George W. Bush awarded the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal, it was a long-overdue acknowledgement of their sacrifices and triumphs. The award was not only a tribute to their military valor, but also a reflection of the social progress made in the decades since World War II. It symbolized the changing tides of racial equality in the United States, a nation still struggling to fully reconcile its ideals with the realities of its history. This recognition was more than just a ceremonial moment. It was a monumental milestone that underscored the fact that the Tuskegee Airmen had not only contributed to the Allied victory, but had also changed the trajectory of race relations in America. Their successes had opened the doors for greater opportunities for African Americans, both in the military and in broader society. The courage and persistence of these men in the face of tremendous obstacles had proven that true greatness was not confined to a particular race, but to the strength of character, determination, and the willingness to fight for what was right. The impact of the Tuskegee Airmen stretched beyond the battlefield. Their accomplishments laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements that would gain momentum in the years following the war. They became symbols of resilience, reminding the nation that racial discrimination could not and should not define a person's worth. In serving their country with honor and distinction, they not only proved their worth as warriors, but also proved that the American ideals of freedom, equality, and justice should apply to all, regardless of race. Though the acknowledgement of their heroism came too late for many of the original Tuskegee Airmen, their legacy remained an indelible part of American history. The airmen's contribution to the war effort and to the fight for civil rights became an enduring lesson to future generations. Their story was a testament to the power of perseverance and the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It also served as a powerful reminder that recognition, though sometimes delayed, would eventually be given to those who had fought for justice and equality, whether in the skies or on the ground. The recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen in 2007 was the closing of a long and painful chapter, one in which their sacrifices had been overlooked and their voices silenced by a society that had refused to fully accept their humanity. But in the end, their story was told, and their place in history was secured. They had broken barriers in the air, and their victories, both on the battlefield and in the fight for civil rights, ensured that their legacy would live on for future generations. Through their bravery, skill, and unwavering commitment to their country, the Tuskegee Airmen had proven that race was not a limitation, but a characteristic of their identity. They had not just defeated an enemy in combat, they had destroyed an entire set of racial myths and prejudices that had long defined the American experience. Their story was no longer one of marginalization, but one of triumph, change, and the enduring power of equality. The historical impact of the Tuskegee Airmen went far beyond their military service. By breaking down racial barriers in the face of adversity, they helped reshape the future of America. Their achievements, though long delayed in recognition, had paved the way for greater opportunities for African Americans and served as a powerful reminder of the importance of perseverance, equality, and justice for all. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen was not just a chapter in military history, but a living legacy of the fight for a more just and equal society.